Cowboy watched Apache burn a letter, and the scent of ink revealed her hidden war. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. Jack Thompson was a man who preferred the quiet life. The rugged hills of the West had always provided him with everything he needed. A small cabin, a few cattle, and the freedom to roam across the open land were all he had ever asked for. His days were spent working, repairing fences, and tending to his animals. Life had a simplicity that suited him well. He kept to himself, avoiding the bustling towns and the noisy people who filled them. He was a cowboy, a drifter by nature, and that was exactly how he liked it. One day, while riding through a narrow canyon near his cabin, Jack spotted a figure in the distance. A woman. She was standing near a small campfire, the smoke curling up into the sky. At first, Jack thought it was just another traveler, someone passing through on their way to somewhere else. But as he drew closer, he saw the woman's face. Her dark eyes met his, and for a moment neither of them moved. Jack had seen many things in his life, but there was something about this woman that caught him off guard. She wasn't just any Apache girl. She was different. Her presence was commanding yet calm. Her posture suggested strength, but also a certain vulnerability. She wasn't afraid of him, even though he was a man with a rifle strapped to his back. Instead, she stood her ground, watching him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Jack felt the weight of her gaze on him as if she were searching for something within him, something he couldn't understand. He stopped his horse, unsure of what to do next. They stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching between them like an unspoken understanding. Finally, the woman spoke. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she said, her voice soft but firm. Jack was surprised by how easily her words came. "I'm just passing through," she added, her eyes still fixed on his. Jack wasn't sure why, but he believed her. Something about her demeanor told him she wasn't lying. He nodded, not knowing what else to say. The woman took a step forward, and Jack instinctively reached for his reins. She watched him closely, then turned her back to him, as if signaling that she was ready to continue her journey. Jack couldn't help but watch her for a moment longer. As she walked away, he noticed something strange. The woman was carrying a small leather pouch, tucked securely against her side. The way she held it, the way it seemed to glisten under the afternoon sun, caught his attention. He couldn't place it, but there was something important about that pouch. Jack didn't have the time to think about it for long. The woman disappeared into the hills, her figure slowly fading into the landscape. He went back to his chores, but something kept nagging at him. Why had she looked at him like that? What had she meant by her words? As the evening drew near, Jack found himself staring out toward the horizon, wondering about the woman he had just encountered. He was no stranger to the ways of the Apache, but this was different. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had just witnessed something more than a simple meeting between two strangers. Little did Jack know, this chance encounter would set off a series of events that would change everything. That night, as the wind howled outside, Jack heard the faint crackling sound of a fire. He looked out the window, and in the dim light, he saw the woman again. This time, she was standing near the edge of the clearing, her back to him as she carefully placed something on the ground. Jack couldn't quite make it out, but he had a feeling it was the pouch. Then, without warning, she set fire to it. The smell of burning leather and ink filled the air, and Jack's heart skipped a beat. He felt a strange pull, a compulsion to understand what she was doing, but he stayed hidden in the shadows, unable to tear his eyes away. The flames flickered and danced, consuming the pouch until only ashes remained. As the smoke rose, Jack caught a scent, a faint, familiar scent. It was the ink from the letter she had burned. The scent was like a memory, one that Jack couldn't quite grasp, but it filled him with a sense of urgency. This was no ordinary moment. The woman, the letter, the pouch, there was something much bigger at play, and Jack was about to be dragged into it. Jack couldn't sleep that night. His mind kept replaying the image of the woman burning the letter. The scent of ink still lingered in the air, but it was more than just the smell. It was a reminder, something in the back of his mind telling him that this moment was far from ordinary. He couldn't shake the feeling that Ayanna, the Apache woman, was hiding something. But what was it? Why would she burn something so important? The next morning, the sun rose slowly over the hills, casting long shadows across the land. Jack decided to follow his instincts and visit the spot where he had seen her the day before. He saddled up his horse and rode out, the cold air biting at his skin. The ride was quiet, with only the sound of his horse's hooves breaking the stillness of the morning. When he reached the clearing, everything seemed calm, just as it had been the day before. But there was something different now. The place felt charged, as if it held a secret Jack was meant to uncover. He dismounted and walked cautiously toward the spot where Ayanna had been standing. As he neared the area, he noticed something in the dirt, half buried under a few fallen leaves. It was the small leather pouch that Ayanna had been carrying. The one she had hidden so carefully. Jack knelt down, his fingers brushing the earth as he retrieved the pouch. It was still warm to the touch, a strange sensation that sent a shiver down his spine. He held it in his hands for a moment, trying to understand its significance. But there was no time for answers just yet. Jack looked up and noticed something else: footprints. The tracks were fresh, leading away from the clearing toward the dense forest. Without thinking, he followed them, a sense of urgency driving him forward. The trail wound through the trees, and Jack's mind raced with questions. Who was Ayanna really? What had she been hiding? And what was the letter about? The deeper he went into the forest, the more the air seemed to change. It became heavier, thicker, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Finally, after what felt like hours, Jack reached a small clearing. In the center of the clearing, he saw Ayanna. She was standing still, her back to him, facing a group of figures Jack couldn't immediately make out. They were cloaked in shadow, their forms indistinct, but there was no mistaking their presence. Ayanna was speaking to them, but Jack couldn't hear her words. The wind carried only fragments of her voice. He took a cautious step forward, then another, careful not to make a sound. But as he moved closer, something in the air shifted. The figures turned their heads, their eyes locking onto Jack. Ayanna's gaze followed theirs, and when her eyes met his, she didn't look surprised. She looked resigned. "I knew you'd come," she said softly, her voice carrying across the clearing. Jack froze, unsure of what to do next. "You've been following me," she continued, her tone steady, but with an edge of something deeper, an emotion Jack couldn't quite place. "Why?" Jack didn't have an answer. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but words failed him. Ayanna took a step toward him, the silence between them almost unbearable. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he took a step back. The figures in the shadows didn't move, but Jack could feel their eyes on him, watching every move. Ayanna's hand reached into the pouch she had been carrying. Jack's breath caught as she pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was a letter, exactly like the one she had burned the night before. "This is the letter," she said, holding it out to him. "But it's not just any letter. It's the key to everything. To the war that's coming." Jack's mind reeled. The war? What was she talking about? He had so many questions, but for some reason, he couldn't bring himself to ask them. Instead, he stood there, watching as Ayanna handed him the letter. The paper felt warm in his hands, the ink still faintly visible, though some of it had smudged. Jack turned it over, his fingers trembling as he unfolded it. The words were simple, but their meaning was clear. Ayanna wasn't just a woman from a distant tribe. She was someone far more important, someone whose actions would shape the future of the land they both lived on. Jack stared at the letter in his hands, the words on the page suddenly feeling like an overwhelming weight. The Apache woman, Ayanna, watched him silently, her expression unreadable. He could feel the tension in the air, thick with unanswered questions, but he couldn't seem to find his voice. She had handed him the letter, but it wasn't just a simple piece of paper. This letter held the truth, a hidden war that was coming, something Jack wasn't prepared for, yet now could not escape. The ink was faint, some of it blurred, but the message was still clear enough. The words spoke of a treaty, a secret alliance, and the return of a powerful enemy. But why had Ayanna burned the first letter? And why was she showing him this one? "I didn't want you to see it like this," Ayanna said quietly, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady, but Jack could hear the hint of something beneath it, something raw, something personal. Jack glanced up from the letter and met her gaze, trying to make sense of everything. "What is this about?" he asked, his voice rough. Ayanna took a deep breath before speaking again. "The war I'm talking about isn't just a battle over land, Jack. It's about survival. Our people are being forced into a corner, and there's no more running." Jack could feel the weight of her words sinking in. He had heard stories, rumors even, about tensions between the settlers and the Apache tribes, but he never imagined it would come to this. "What do you mean by our people? You're talking about your tribe, right?" he asked, still trying to grasp the scope of what was unfolding. Ayanna nodded slowly. "Yes, but it's more than just the Apache. It's all the tribes in the area. We've been in peace for years, but there are those who want to destroy that peace. To force us into war." Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He had never wanted to get involved in any conflicts, especially not one involving the Apache. He had always kept his distance, kept to his quiet life. But now, standing in this clearing with Ayanna and holding this letter, he knew he couldn't turn away. "So what now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ayanna's gaze softened for a moment, but there was a determination in her eyes that made Jack pause. "Now we fight," she said. "But it's not just about fighting. It's about standing together, finding strength in unexpected places. And you, Jack, are one of those places." Jack blinked, confused. "What are you asking of me?" he asked, his voice thick with uncertainty. Ayanna stepped closer, the distance between them closing as she spoke. "I'm asking you to help us, to stand with us. The war isn't just coming for the Apache, it's coming for everyone." Jack could feel the gravity of her words, and the weight of the decision he was about to make. He wasn't a fighter. He was a cowboy, a rancher, a man who had lived a quiet life by choice. But something about the way Ayanna spoke, the raw honesty in her voice, stirred something within him. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew it was something powerful. "I don't know how I can help," Jack said, his voice tinged with doubt. "I've lived my life in the shadows. I don't even know how to fight a war." Ayanna's lips curved into a faint smile. "You don't need to know how to fight, Jack. You just need to know how to stand." Jack's mind raced as he looked at her, taking in the strength in her posture and the sincerity in her eyes. For the first time, he felt like he was being asked to be part of something bigger than himself. Something important. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know what the future would hold, but standing here with Ayanna, he knew one thing for sure: his quiet life was over. There was a war coming, and whether he was ready or not, it was about to change everything. The days following Jack's decision were strange, filled with a restless tension he couldn't shake. Ayanna had asked for his help, but Jack had never been a part of anything like this. He had always been content to live alone on his ranch, far from the troubles of the world. But now, standing on the edge of something much larger than himself, he found himself questioning everything. The war Ayanna spoke of wasn't some distant conflict. It was coming, and it was coming for everyone. He couldn't ignore it. Jack spent the next few days in a daze, trying to prepare himself for whatever was about to unfold. He worked on his ranch, fixing fences, tending to the cattle, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about Ayanna, about the letter, about the hidden war that was rapidly becoming a reality. Ayanna had given him little more than a warning and a letter, but it was clear that she wasn't alone. There was something about her that made Jack feel both afraid and strangely drawn to her. She was a woman who carried the weight of her people's survival on her shoulders, and yet there was a calmness about her that Jack couldn't explain. One morning, as Jack was preparing his horse for a ride into town, he heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching from the distance. He turned and saw Iona riding toward him, her silhouette framed by the early morning sun. She pulled her horse to a stop in front of him, her dark eyes meeting his with a look of quiet resolve. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady. Jack nodded, unsure of what to say. "What is it?" he asked, his voice a little rougher than he intended. Iona dismounted, her movements smooth and deliberate. She stood for a moment, looking at him, as though weighing her words. "There's something you need to understand," she began. "This war isn't just about territory. It's about something much more dangerous. It's about a man who wants to see our people destroyed. His name is Colonel Thorne." Jack's heart skipped a beat at the name. He had heard whispers about a colonel who was leading an aggressive campaign against the Apache, but he hadn't expected to hear about him from Iona. "Thorne," Jack repeated. "I've heard of him." Iona's face hardened at the mention of the name. "He's not just some officer following orders. He's a man driven by hate, and he will stop at nothing to wipe us out. He believes that if he destroys the Apache, he will secure his place in history. He's been hunting us for years, and now, he's closing in." Jack could see the pain in her eyes, the weight of the burden she carried. She wasn't just fighting for her people's survival. She was fighting for something deeper, something that had been taken from them long ago. "What do you want me to do?" Jack asked, his voice low. Iona didn't hesitate. "I need you to help us stop him. We can't do it alone. We need someone who knows the land, someone who understands the ways of the settlers. You're that person, Jack. We can't win this fight without you." Jack felt a rush of conflicting emotions. He had never been a warrior. He had never wanted to be involved in any battle, let alone a war that could change the course of history. But Iona's plea, the determination in her voice, made it impossible for him to turn away. He wasn't sure how he could help, or even if he was capable, but one thing was clear: he couldn't just stand by and watch. "I'll help," Jack said finally, his voice steady with resolve. "But I don't know what I can do. I'm not a fighter." Iona smiled faintly, a rare expression of relief passing over her features. "You don't have to be," she said. "We all have a part to play. Even the quietest voices can make a difference." Jack nodded, understanding what she meant. It wasn't about fighting battles on the front lines. It was about making sure the right people had the chance to fight, making sure the people who needed help could stand up for themselves. Iona reached into her pouch and handed Jack a small, folded piece of paper. "This is a map," she explained. "It's a route we've been using to move our people in secret. It's the safest way to avoid Thorne's soldiers." Jack took the map from her, his fingers brushing hers for a brief moment. The touch was fleeting, but it left an impression that lingered with him long after she had walked away. As she mounted her horse and rode off into the distance, Jack stood there, holding the map in his hands. He had made his choice. He was no longer just a cowboy. He was part of something much bigger, and he would do whatever it took to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Jack spent the next few days studying the map Iona had given him, trying to familiarize himself with the land and the route she had marked. He knew the area well, but this map revealed paths he had never noticed before, hidden trails that wound through dense forests and across wide plains, places where settlers rarely ventured. These paths would offer safety, but only if they were kept secret. Jack couldn't help but think about the war Iona had spoken of. He had never thought of himself as a hero, never imagined he would be drawn into a conflict of such magnitude. His life had always been simple, isolated. But now, with this map in his hands and the weight of his promise to Iona pressing on him, he knew there was no turning back. One evening, as Jack was sitting by his fire, the sound of approaching hooves broke the stillness of the night. His first instinct was to reach for his rifle, but then he recognized the familiar rhythm of hooves. It was Ayanna. She rode into the clearing and dismounted, her face serious as always. "We need to move," she said, her voice low and urgent. Jack stood, unsure of what she meant. "What do you mean? Move where?" Ayanna handed him a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "The soldiers are getting closer. We can't wait any longer. You need to help me get the others to safety." Jack felt a sense of dread settle in his stomach. "How many soldiers are there?" Ayanna's eyes darkened. "Enough to cause trouble. But we can't fight them all." "Not yet." Jack took the bundle from her and nodded. "All right, I'll help. But where are we going?" "There's a safe house in the mountains," Ayanna replied. "We've been using it to shelter the women and children, but it's only a matter of time before they find it too. We need to get there before they do." Jack followed her lead, grabbing his gear and saddling up his horse. The night was cold, and the wind whispered through the trees as they rode in silence. As they traveled, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The trees seemed to stretch out, their shadows dark and ominous, but Ayanna rode with the confidence of someone who had been in this world long before Jack had ever set foot on it. After several hours of riding, they reached the foot of the mountains. The terrain grew steeper, and the paths narrower. But Ayanna moved with ease, her horse sure-footed in the rocky terrain. They reached a small clearing just as the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon. Ayanna dismounted and motioned for Jack to follow her into the dense woods. They had arrived at the safe house. It was a small cabin, hidden from sight by thick trees and a natural rock formation that shielded it from view. Inside, a few women and children were gathered around a small fire, the flickering light casting long shadows on the walls. They all looked up when Ayanna entered, their expressions a mixture of relief and fear. "We've made it," Ayanna said quietly, her tone softening for the first time. Jack set his gear down and looked around. The cabin was simple, but it was enough to offer them shelter for now. But how long would it last? How long before the soldiers found them here too? Jack could feel the tension in the air. It was palpable, hanging over them like a storm waiting to break. "We'll stay here for now," Ayanna said, breaking the silence. "But we can't stay long. We have to keep moving, keep ahead of them." Jack nodded, his thoughts racing. The gravity of what he had promised to do was starting to weigh on him. He was no longer just a cowboy. He was a part of something much bigger, a part of a fight he never asked for. But as he looked around the room at the women and children, he knew there was no turning back now. He was in this fight, whether he was ready or not. And he would do whatever it took to help them survive. Days passed in a blur as Jack settled into the routine of moving with Ayanna and the others, always one step ahead of the soldiers. The cabin had given them a brief respite, but they couldn't stay long. They would pack up in the dead of night, moving silently through the mountains, keeping to the hidden paths. Jack had never seen the world like this. He had always been isolated, focused on the quiet life of ranching. But now, he saw the land in a new way, no longer just wide-open spaces for grazing cattle, but a battleground, a place where survival meant outwitting those who would destroy everything you held dear. Ayanna had become more than just a guide to him, she had become the symbol of everything worth fighting for. Her quiet strength, her commitment to protecting her people, had drawn Jack into this struggle in ways he never expected. They were headed further north now, toward a remote mountain village where they could rest for a while before moving again. But as they neared the village, a sense of unease crept over Jack. The soldiers were getting closer. They had seen signs of them on the horizon, the distant dust clouds marking their progress. The war was coming, and there was no way to escape it. When they arrived at the village, the mood was heavy. The villagers, mostly women and children, had gathered in a small clearing at the center of their homes. They had heard rumors of the soldiers' advance, and fear was beginning to settle in. Ayanna led Jack to the leader of the village, an older woman named Natsy, who greeted them with a solemn expression. "We've been waiting for you," Natsy said, her voice calm but tinged with worry. Ayanna nodded, looking around at the group of women and children. "We need to move quickly," she said. The soldiers are close. Natsy's gaze shifted to Jack, her eyes narrowing slightly. And you are? She asked, her tone polite but guarded. Jack straightened up, feeling the weight of the situation. I'm Jack, he said simply. I'm here to help. Natsy studied him for a long moment before nodding. We could use all the help we can get. The plan was simple. They would stay in the village long enough to rest and gather supplies, but they couldn't stay longer than that. The soldiers would be there soon, and when they arrived, they would do everything in their power to protect the women and children. Jack felt a growing sense of urgency as he helped carry supplies, his mind racing with the thought of what was to come. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about resistance. It was about standing together against those who sought to destroy them. That evening, as Jack sat by the fire with Ayana, she turned to him, her face serious. You know what's at stake, she said. This isn't just about us. It's about everyone who's been driven from their land, everyone who's been pushed to the edge. This war isn't just a battle for survival. It's a battle for our very existence. Jack nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. He had always thought of himself as just a cowboy, someone who kept to himself and stayed out of trouble. But now, he realized, he was a part of something much larger. He was fighting not just for the Apache, but for the future of all those who had been wronged, all those who had been pushed aside in the name of progress. I'm ready, Jack said, his voice steady. Ayana gave him a small, approving nod. Good. We need everyone who's willing to fight. The next morning, they set out once again, moving with the dawn. They were leaving the village behind, heading further into the mountains, but Jack knew this would be the last time they would be able to hide. The soldiers would find them soon enough, and when they did, there would be no place left to run. But Jack didn't feel fear anymore. He felt resolve. He had chosen his side, and there was no going back. As they rode on, the landscape seemed to stretch endlessly before them, the mountains rising in the distance like silent sentinels. And Jack, for the first time in his life, felt like he was part of something bigger than himself, something that could change the course of history. The days blurred together as Jack and Ayana continued their journey further into the mountains. The path grew steeper, the terrain more rugged, but they kept moving forward, always with the thought of the soldiers on their trail. Jack had never been so deep into the mountains before. The air was thinner here, the sky a sharp blue that seemed to stretch endlessly above them. He had spent most of his life in the wide open plains, but this was different. This felt like a place of refuge, a place where secrets were hidden among the towering peaks and deep valleys. Ayana led them with quiet confidence, her eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. She knew these mountains better than anyone, and Jack trusted her judgment completely. They had been traveling for days now, staying hidden during the daylight hours and moving only under the cover of darkness. The sense of urgency hung heavy in the air. They were close, but Jack knew that the soldiers weren't far behind. As they made their way through a narrow pass between two steep cliffs, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He slowed his horse, his senses heightened. He looked around, trying to make sense of the strange stillness in the air. What is it? Ayana asked, noticing his sudden hesitation. Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his head, scanning the surroundings. He could hear the faintest sound, a noise that didn't belong in the quiet of the mountains. The clink of metal. The shuffle of boots. The unmistakable sound of soldiers. Ayana's face hardened, her eyes narrowing with focus. They'd found us, she said quietly, almost to herself. Jack's heart raced. The soldiers were closer than he had thought. They couldn't afford to be caught now, not when they were so close to the safe house. He turned to Ayana. We need to move. Now. Ayana nodded, already moving swiftly. She led the way, urging their horses forward through the pass, their hooves striking the ground with urgency. Jack followed closely behind, his mind racing as he tried to plan their next move. The soldiers weren't far off, and they couldn't outrun them on horseback. They needed a place to hide, a place where the soldiers wouldn't think to look. They reached the edge of the pass and paused, listening for any sign of pursuit. The wind howled through the mountains, carrying with it the sound of distant voices. Jack's stomach tightened. "They're getting closer," he said. Ayanna turned to him. "There's a cave up ahead. We can take cover there." Without hesitation, Jack followed her, spurring his horse forward. The path grew narrower as they approached the cave, the rocks on either side of them rising higher and higher. When they reached the entrance, Jack quickly dismounted, pulling his horse into the shadows of the cave. Ayanna followed, leading her horse into the darkness. They stood there for a moment, listening. The sound of the soldiers grew louder, their voices carried by the wind. Jack's pulse quickened. They were close. Too close. Ayanna motioned for Jack to crouch low, and he obeyed, taking cover behind a large boulder at the entrance of the cave. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours as they waited, holding their breath. Jack's eyes never left the narrow opening, his body tense with anticipation. Finally, they heard the sound of footsteps. The soldiers had arrived. They were just outside, their voices muffled but unmistakable. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. Ayanna was right beside him, her body still, every muscle poised for action. The soldiers stopped at the mouth of the cave, their shadows stretching across the ground in front of them. Jack could feel the tension in the air, could almost taste the danger that was so close. But they didn't move. The soldiers stood there, their voices rising and falling in low conversation, but Jack couldn't make out their words. Time seemed to stand still as they waited, hoping against hope that the soldiers would pass by without discovering them. It felt like an eternity before the sound of footsteps began to fade. The soldiers were moving away, their voices growing quieter as they retreated back down the mountain. Jack let out a long, slow breath, his body relaxing slightly. Ayanna remained still for a moment longer before she finally spoke. "We've bought ourselves some time," she said softly. Jack nodded, though his heart was still racing. They weren't out of danger yet. But they had made it through this moment. And that, for now, was enough. The next few days passed in a blur of cautious movement. Jack and Ayanna continued their journey through the mountains, always staying just one step ahead of the soldiers. They made their way through dense forests, across rocky hills, and down winding paths, avoiding the main trails as much as possible. Jack had never felt such a constant tension in the air, as though the land itself was holding its breath. The quiet was oppressive, broken only by the sound of hooves on the rocky paths and the occasional distant crack of a branch. They didn't talk much during these days. There was no need for words between them. Ayanna's presence was enough, her quiet determination, the way she moved with purpose, always alert, always ready. Jack had never seen anyone so focused, so sure of their path. He admired her strength, but he could also see the weight of the responsibility she carried. It wasn't just about survival for her. It was about her people, her tribe, their future. Every decision she made was for them, and Jack could feel the depth of that commitment in the way she held herself. Ayanna had been born into this fight, but Jack was new to it. He had never considered himself a warrior, never thought of himself as someone who could change anything. But every day that passed, he felt the shift inside him. He wasn't the same man who had ridden out to the mountains a week ago. He had become something more, something he couldn't yet define. It wasn't until they reached the foot of another mountain that Ayanna finally spoke again. They had been traveling for hours, and the trail was steep. The air was thin, and Jack could feel his breath coming in shorter bursts. They had taken refuge in a small cave for the night, sheltering from the wind and the biting cold. As the fire crackled, Ayanna sat across from him, staring into the flames. "We can't keep running forever," she said quietly, her voice carrying a heaviness that Jack hadn't heard before. Jack looked up at her, sensing the change in her tone. "What do you mean?" he asked, though he had a feeling he already knew the answer. Ayanna sighed, a deep, weary sound. "We can only hide for so long. The soldiers will find us eventually. And when they do—" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Jack knew what she was implying. When the soldiers found them, it would be too late. The safety of the women and children would be gone. The war would be at their doorstep. Jack sat in silence, letting her words settle into him. There was a choice to be made, he realized. They could continue hiding, always moving, always one step ahead. Or they could make a stand. Ayanna wasn't just asking for his help anymore. She was asking him to be part of something bigger, to make a choice that could change everything. "What do you want to do?" Jack asked, his voice steady. Ayanna looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face. "We fight," she said simply. Jack nodded. He had known it was coming. The time for running was over. The time to fight had arrived. The path ahead wasn't clear, but it didn't matter. Jack had already made his choice. "We fight," he repeated, his voice firm. The fire flickered between them, the crackling flames casting shadows on the walls of the cave. For the first time, Jack didn't feel like an outsider. He felt like he was part of something real. Something worth fighting for. They spent the next few hours preparing, organizing their supplies, and planning their next steps. Ayanna's quiet leadership guided them, and Jack found himself following her every decision, trusting her judgment. As they packed up to leave the cave and head deeper into the mountains, Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose he had never known. The world was changing, and he was no longer just a passive observer. He was part of the fight. And no matter what came next, he was ready. As the days passed, Jack and Ayanna grew closer to their destination, the small outpost in the mountains where they planned to make their stand. They had stopped moving during the day, only traveling under the cover of night. The nights were cold, and the air was thin, but the stillness of the mountains made it easy to listen for any signs of pursuit. The closer they got to the outpost, the more Jack's thoughts turned inward. This was real now. There was no turning back. Ayanna had told him they would fight, but Jack wasn't sure what that meant. They weren't soldiers. They were just people, trying to survive, trying to protect the ones they loved. But as the days stretched on, Jack began to understand. It wasn't just about the fight. It was about standing up for what was right. It was about making sure that when history looked back on this time, they would be remembered as the ones who fought for their freedom, for their people, for their lives. One night, as they huddled around a small campfire, Ayanna finally spoke again, her voice soft but resolute. "We'll be there soon," she said, looking into the flames. "We'll have a chance to rest, to regroup, to plan." Jack nodded, though a part of him still wasn't sure what to expect. The mountain outpost was meant to be a safe haven, but how safe could it really be? They had already seen the soldiers closing in, and Jack knew it was only a matter of time before they found them. "How many people will be waiting for us there?" he asked. Ayanna didn't look up from the fire as she answered. "A few. We've been building support in the region, but it's not enough. That's why we need your help, Jack. You know this land. You understand how to survive here." Jack didn't know what to say. He had always been a loner, preferring the solitude of his ranch to the bustling towns and the noise of the world. But now, in this moment, he understood that there was no choice. The people in the outpost were depending on them. They were depending on him. "I'll help," Jack said quietly. Ayanna met his gaze then, her eyes steady. "I know you will." The night passed uneventfully, the stars above twinkling faintly in the cold sky. Jack lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of the night. The wind rustled the trees, and in the distance, he could hear the soft hoot of an owl. It was peaceful here, far from the chaos that had begun to sweep across the land. But that peace was fleeting. The soldiers were coming. They always were. The next morning, they packed up quickly and continued on their journey. The mountain paths grew steeper as they ascended higher, the terrain more treacherous. Jack's muscles ached from the constant movement, but he pushed through it, determined to keep going. Ayanna was leading the way, her focus unwavering. As they neared the outpost, Jack could feel a sense of anticipation building in his chest. This was it. This was the moment they had been preparing for. When they finally reached the outpost, it was exactly as Ayanna had described. A small cluster of cabins, hidden in the heart of the mountains, sheltered by towering trees and jagged rocks. It was the perfect place to make a stand. But as Jack dismounted and looked around, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence here was different. It was too quiet. Ayanna seemed to sense his unease. "Something's not right," she said, her voice low. "Stay close." They moved cautiously through the outpost, checking each cabin, peering through the windows. There were no signs of life. The place looked abandoned. "Where is everyone?" Jack asked, his voice filled with concern. Ayanna's face hardened. "They'd been taken." Jack felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He had hoped they would find refuge here, but now, it seemed that the soldiers had beaten them to it. The outpost wasn't a sanctuary. It was a trap. "We need to get out of here," Jack said, his heart racing. But Ayanna stopped him. "No," she said firmly. "We're not leaving. This is still our best chance." Jack looked at her, unsure of what to do. The soldiers were close. The outpost was empty. But Ayanna's resolve was unshakable. "We stay," she said, her voice steady. "We make our stand here." Jack hesitated, but then he nodded. If this was where the fight would happen, then he would be ready. He wasn't a soldier, but he was ready to stand by Ayanna and fight for what was right. Whatever came next, they would face it together.